First of all, for everyone that's joined, good morning. Thank you so much for hopping in today. My name is Dave Carr. I'm the founder and owner of BuyOrBorrow Music, and I'm joined by Scott Marquart, who is the founder and owner of Stringjoy. So we
Mhm.
are just so thankful to have you here with us today. And we're going to be diving into the topic of demystifying guitar strings. And I
Mhm.
think, for something that is so simple that I think a lot of us take for granted as guitar players, there's a lot of science behind it.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be one of the fun things that we get to chat about today with Scott is just demystifying and diving into that topic.
Yeah.
For everybody that is joining, by the way, we are going to give a code at the end of the webinar to get your free strings. So you can use that on buyerborrowmusic.com, grab a set of string joys, check them out, see if you love them as much as we do. So with that, Scott, I'm just going to hop right into it, man. And
Yeah.
so where I'd love to start out is just, talking about mysteries and misconceptions about guitar strings. I know there are a
Yeah.
ton. So I would love for you to maybe address some of those most common misconceptions. And then how did you guys really set out at Stringjoy to address some of those in your manufacturing process?
Yeah, sure. So I would say probably the biggest misconception that exists in our world is everyone's probably heard this from somebody at a retail counter or a guitar teacher or something, that there's only two or three companies in the whole world that make all the guitar strings for everybody. I still hear this all the time. We'll have ads where people are telling us, oh, ain't but two companies that make strings. There's more than that. Now there's a grain of truth in this, in that there are a lot fewer string manufacturers and there are brands that you're going to see
Mm.
on the wall at a guitar store. So a lot of strings are what we would call private labels. So they're made by a particular company. In some cases, they are made to a buyer's specification, though, in my opinion, pretty much all of those sets say made to our particular specifications, and more commonly than not, they aren't. They're just like sort of the off the rack strings that company would make otherwise, that are sold under a different brand. And there are exceptions to that, of course. But the reason being is, I work with some master luthiers that know everything about guitars, or techs that have like worked on every guitar that you could ever possibly think of. They know everything about the entire guitar, but those guys don't know the first thing about strings. If you throw them on a winding machine and give them a bunch of wire and tell them, hey, make me a great set of strings, even the best luthier in the world will have no idea what they're
Yeah.
doing. So it's always kind of funny, when people are like, "Oh, to the exacting specifications of blank," and it's like they don't know, they don't know
Right.
what kind of makes a great string there. So that's definitely a common misconception, and to like put a bow on it, we do make all of our own strings in house. We actually don't do any private label for any other company either.
Mm.
No shade on those that do. For us, we think that the strings that are inside the package are like the real thing that differentiate us, not just the branding or the marketing or things like that. But those are cool. So we don't really love the idea of somebody else being able to take credit for
Yeah.
that.
Right.
So every string that we make is a Stringjoy string, and every Stringjoy string that you see out there in the wild is made right here in our shop and our factory in Tennessee. Now, kind of diving into that a little bit more, I think that the reason that people probably assume that there's only two or three manufacturers is because everyone imagines that a string factory is probably this like giant three-story high Willy Wonka style machine that you press a button and then it spits out a pack of strings. And it's not quite like that. That would be really cool, but we're not quite there yet. So I could talk a little bit about what actually goes into making a guitar string, and maybe that'll make a little bit more sense. Excuse me. So a guitar string consists typically of three things. There's a brass ball end, which is sort of incidental to the tone and performance of a string. It just kind of holds the string in your saddle, or in your tailpiece. And then there is core wire, which is typically made of steel. This is either round or hexagonal, depending on whether it's going to be a plain string or a wound string. And then finally, there's wrap wire, and that's what you usually hear strings differentiated by. So you'll hear
Mm.
like a nickel plated steel string, phosphor bronze string, pure nickel string,
Yeah.
80/20 bronze string. All those are just different wrap wire. The core wire, the ball end, are still the same on all of those strings. And importantly, and this is a very common misconception, the plain strings, so the non-wound strings in a set, are the same regardless of whether it's an electric string or an acoustic string or a pure nickel string or a nickel plated steel string. The only thing that's really changing are those wound strings. in effect. And it is funny. I will see even like web descriptions from companies that make strings where they'll talk about like pure nickel strings as pure nickel, the way that that word kind of sounds, that it's a nickel core. But nickel's really soft and would not really work for a guitar core. The steel that's used in guitar cores is known as music wire. It evolved from piano wire. It's some of the strongest steel that exists. It's the same stuff that's used for bridge cables and things like that. Because if you think about it, taking a 9, so 9, when you hear those numbers in guitar strings, those are referring to the diameter in thousandths of an inch. So a 9 that you'd have on like a high E string on a set of 9s is going to be about like 2 to 3 times the thickness of a human hair. So a really thin wire. And what do we do as guitarists? We stretch that over a 25.5-inch length. Up to about 25 pounds of tension or more, and then we sweat on it, we bend it, we push it against metal frets, and if it breaks within the first 2 months, we're like, oh, what a crap string.
Right.
But what you're doing, to that incredibly thin wire, you're doing a lot. You're asking a lot of that wire to continue to do that and be able to maintain consistent tension, and not have issues as time goes on. So the strength of music wire, this product is a really incredible thing that has to be really, really strong and really durable to be able to make a great set of strings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it always blows my mind too, to think about how much tension is on a guitar neck, like PSI perspective,
Yep.
right? I mean, and you would know much better than me. I mean, what the actual
Sure.
stress
I mean,
is.
you'll typically see, between like 100 pounds at the very low end up to 200 pounds, sometimes more, of tension being applied to a guitar neck, which is a
Yeah.
whole lot of tension, really. Those strings are under a lot of tension. The neck on your guitar is under a lot of tension. And until truss rods came around, which most people probably know, but it's a rod that reinforces the strength of the wood neck of your guitar. Before those came around, that's why you had things like gut strings, things that didn't have
Yeah.
quite as much tension, because you can't just like take a 2x4 and put 200 pounds of tension on it and not expect it to bow on its own.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so you talked about the ball end of the string.
Yeah,
So I want to dive in there and have a couple questions for you on that. But for everybody that's attending, we also want to keep this interactive. So number one, we're going to be throwing out some polls as we go along. In fact, I'm going to go
cool.
ahead and do that, one of our first ones now. And if you guys have questions as well, you have a raise hand button. So if you want to hit, raise your hand, I'll make sure to, to pop that out. But our first question here is just going to be, what's your favorite string gauge, right? And
Mm,
it's, light, medium, heavy, hybrid, whatever you want. I'm a hybrid guy myself. I love heavy
mhm.
bottom, light top, especially on
Yeah.
my Gibsons. So yeah, we got some folks rolling in. So yeah, pretty even keel between medium, heavy, hybrid. Medium's taking the lead now, so 50% there. Not surprising. And Scott, what do you see as your most popular sales when you?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting topic in and of itself. So light gauge is typically the most popular,
Hmm,
10s for electric or 12s for acoustic.
okay.
But it's an interesting thing the way that these names were called, because you have like mediums, you almost never see heavies.
Yeah.
And then you have regular light, super light, custom light, ultra light, extra light, all of these things. And it seems odd that somebody would choose from the beginning to make that the nomenclature of things, right?
Right.
You would assume like 11s would be heavy, 10s would be medium, 9s would be light, right? The reason for this is way back in the day, a light gauge set, like a 12 gauge set, would be about the lightest gauge that you could find, whether it's for electric or acoustic. And then you would see a 13 medium, and then a 14 heavy, and sometimes 15 extra heavy as well. It wasn't until the late 60s that we started to kind of dive deeper than what was called light back in the day, or even to make what you would consider normal electric guitar string gauges at all. That happened in the late 60s. In the early days, people like Jimmy Page, and Jimi Hendrix would be basically taking a very light banjo string, which is the lightest string you could find at the time. They made 9s or 10s, but really just for banjo. They would pop it onto the top end and then buy a regular like 6-string set and slide every string down one. So that's how you would make something like a 10 or a 9. The 13 to 46 would have typically been the that was intended to be the E to A, and then it became
Mhm.
slid down to be the B to E. And that's where those early kind of gauges, some of which that still kind of continue to this day, came from. And that is one of the reasons that our gauges are a little bit different. Our 10 to 46 is a 10 to 48. Those gauges that kind of became really, really popular were fairly incidental. They really were just kind of developed by players doing this process and sliding everything down. That 46 was never meant to be an E. It was meant to be an A, and just got kind of moved over because
Wow.
that's what people could do,
Huh.
right? Yeah. So when we came around, of course, like all these other companies were around at the time. Players started having this 10 to 46 gauge or whatever. So they all just were like, okay, we'll make that, whatever it is that you guys are using. But no one really like sat down and thought like, okay, how would we construct this? It was sort
Yeah.
of just developed by the market. And they got really close, to be honest. Like, it's not a bad set. You can do a ton of things with the 10 to 46 set. But we find that 48 on the low E just brings just a little bit more tension to balance the set out overall. Same thing with a 13.5 instead of a 13 on the B. Really, really slight changes, but just to, pull it into balance with what makes sense for players now. And now that we kind of understand this and can think about how would we do this for its actual, utility.
Well, and this is what I love about conversations like this, because I mean, I had never thought like, where do those string gauges originate from? And, and I'd always heard the stories as well of, Jimmy and those guys were just, playing such thick strings. And you think about the bends that they were doing, at that time with what they had, but I had no idea about the banjo string. So I learned something that is super
and that's
cool.
how, Jimmy Page would play eights back in the day, eights or nines, depending on what he can kind of cook up. Hendrix is best known for a 10 to 38 set, which became like a Fender hybrid set. Which is actually really, really light on the low E. Like a 38 is a crazy light low E. But it makes sense because he could just like, pull that low E all the way up, as like a two-step bend.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, and I think that also, you look at how string gauges have changed. It also shapes playing styles too, right? Because, before that, you didn't have people, doing those kind of bends. So it's interesting to see how artists take it creatively. So let's talk a little bit as well. And a reminder, if you guys have other questions, again, hit the hand raise. We're happy to take a break. I've got plenty for Scott, but we'd love to hear from you. The next thing I wanted to go into, you talk about the ball end, and I don't think I, again, realized how important that is, or in the whole process. And you guys do something a little differently, right? Or in the terms of how you wind around the ball end and what you do to prevent breakage.
Yeah, totally. So the ball enders are kind of what set the whole rest of a string factory in motion. You do a slightly different twist for wound strings versus plain strings. Plain strings have that, we call it a drop twist, but the tail of the wire circles around itself to kind of hold it in. It's actually really similar to a fishing knot, if anyone out there are like fly fishermen.
Yeah.
But the strength of that, especially on the plain strings where you're not adding more material over top of it, is going to really dictate whether you're going to have issues with tuning or intonation as time goes on with a set, or whether it will install at all or just like kind of come undone on the ball end that it can there. The two things that we do differently are not really crazy rocket science. For one, we have a slightly longer twist than some manufacturers. It can spook some people sometimes, like on acoustic. They're like, hey, I'm used to this like all sitting under the saddle. But that slightly longer twist, it just gives it a little bit more grab and helps it basically not be so likely to come undone, and helps it hold tuning in general for longer. But the other big thing that we do, and I should be honest, I know a couple of other companies in the industry that I'm like closer with. Some people, like the big guys, I've never been inside their factory, so I don't know for sure how they do it. But for us, the biggest thing that we do to help that twist just kind of hold better is just do that operation a little bit more slowly. And I'll probably touch on that a few times in the winding and other processes. That's what a lot of it comes down to, is if you're operating at a certain speed, you're going to have some compromises to operate on that speed. You can operate slower and make something, 10% better. But of course, that's operator time, that's labor time. And if you're trying to sell things for a really, really low price, it can be difficult. I'm going a little bit off script here, but something that's worth kind of noting. So if you look back at any guitar or string catalogs back in the 50s and 60s, you'll see that strings used to cost about $5, $6, basically the same that they cost now. Strings were sold back in the 50s and 60s for what is the inflation adjusted equivalent today of about $60. They used to be way more expensive relative, to the purchasing power of the time. What seems to have happened, and again, I wasn't alive for many of these years, but over time, those prices just never changed, and it's not uncommon for things to kind of stay a certain way for a while, but it's abnormal in any industry to have prices literally not change in dollar terms over 50, 60 years. And I only have theories as to why that is. I don't know for sure. My guess is that you have a hyper competitive industry, a couple people at the top that are all really locked in. And if I were them, the worry would be, oh man, if I go up from $5.99 to $6.99, the other people are going to take all the market. So I've got to stay right here. Yeah, exactly. And so, what happens over 50 years of you having to basically cut a product into a tenth of what it used to cost, you have to make compromises, and it might be a slight compromise one this year, another compromise in 5 years, but over time, I mean, that's a huge reduction in overall cost. And some of that is just technology and being able to do things with less labor. But at least in one man's opinion, I think there were some quality compromises that occurred along the way, and maybe not insidiously, just hey, we can run this faster. Okay, we got to, because it's hard to keep selling these for this price with this amount of labor. And so one of the biggest things that we kind of came in to do is simply say, all right, we're not going to optimize for making the cheapest strings in the world. We're going to try to optimize for making the best strings in the world, and still try to, of course, be competitive. We're not selling $30-$40 sets of electric guitar strings. But how do we kind of find that middle ground where something's still approachable to regular people? It's not going to break the bank, but it's going to be the best quality string that we possibly can make for that price. And most of that comes down to better trained operators, and then people that are able to take the time to make the right thing, and operators that are not like just totally kind of under the whip, where it's like, hey, this is your quota, you've got to make this much no matter what, which happens in factories. And they're afraid to say, hey, I don't think the strings that I'm making are very good. I think I should stop making strings right now and work on this problem and figure out how to make them good. Our operators have more freedom to do that, I think, than I would imagine you see at a lot of companies.
Well, and what I hear about and through all of that, Scott, is just slowing down, right?
Yeah.
And even as us as artists, right? I mean, good art takes time. And if you're putting in the care and the attention to doing that, of course, you're going to get better quality. And one of the things that stood out when we first met, and I was learning more about Stringjoy, was that I think somebody used the term, we do like 20 to 30 things 5% better. And the culmination of that adds up, right? So we're going to do this slower. We're going to do this better. We're going to pick better, wire and steel. So I think there was one other thing that I had heard about the way that you guys do windings, right? So you actually do a little bit different process with tensioning, if I remember correctly, and how you do the winds.
Yeah, so all of our strings are wound at or above playing tension. And the way that we wind our strings, we're very, very careful to get the most wire that we can onto a core wire. What that is in effect is basically the distance between each wind. We really focus on trying to get that as tight as humanly possible, and getting as much mass onto a particular gauge of string as possible. What that means for you in playing terms, if you have a higher mass string of a particular gauge, you're going to have more output from that string. You're going to have, typically we see better tuning stability, more of a smoother feel. A lot of players report overall. And just kind of a higher quality string. What it can in effect do is, when you have these turns of wire around a core wire, the distance between them, or lack thereof, is what creates kind of gaps that sweat, dirt, grime, and stuff can get down into the string, get down to the core wire, and cause your strings to die or prematurely corrode. All those sorts of things that cause strings to not sound the same, a month later versus when you first string them up. With the way that we wind strings, our aim certainly is to make strings that are going to have a more consistent tonality over time. A lot of the big companies make strings that, at least in my opinion, they sound super, super bright on day one, and then by day 2 or day 3, they lose a lot of that brightness, right? And something that you'll notice, with a lot of those big companies, you'll see these names on the package where it's like, Eric Clapton, or, that's just an example, but like these huge names. But if you ever go to a show, you'll notice they play on one guitar for like 2 songs, and then a tech comes out and grabs it. Typically, those guys are changing strings on every single guitar, every single show. So in a lot of cases, those strings are getting played for about 15 minutes. So that, maybe that kind of brand allegiance may be more of an indication of strings that perform really, really well for 15 minutes than the strings that you at home would play for a long time. And that's an interesting thing. I think in a lot of industries, like take tires, race car drivers need much more advanced tires than, I do on my Jeep. Because
they're also using them for short amounts of time.
Well, right. They're artists, right? Yeah, exactly. But I was going to say, I think that actually guitarists that are at home need more sophisticated and better quality strings in some cases than guys do that are out on the road, because they're the ones that are going to be playing the same set of strings for 1, 2, 3, 4 months.
That's incredibly interesting, because I mean, you're right. And I even think back to, in my younger years when I was playing, every single weekend. I mean, we changed every single show, right? Because you
Yep.
wanted strings to be bright.
And I would do the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. But when you're playing at home, you don't always have the luxury to do that. So that's
Yep.
very interesting. We do have a couple questions that are coming
Sure.
in. We've got two. I'm going to start out. Frederick asked the first one, which is, does the guitar size, so as an example, a jumbo guitar, matter as to which string gauge and tension he should use?
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to like the size of the body, like on an acoustic, in your example, not necessarily. Now, obviously, you can use strings as a tool to kind of bring out the sound of like a larger body guitar. Like, heavier strings are going to resonate even more, or you can use them as a tool to more counteract what you have in the guitar. But where you do see strings having to kind of change alongside the guitar is actually more to do with scale length. So if you have like a 25-inch guitar and a 27-inch guitar in terms of like your overall scale length, the 27-inch scale length will have more tension with the same string gauge. So you can get away with generally, all other things being the same, tuning and whatnot, you can get away with slightly lighter strings, smaller gauge, on a longer scale length than on a shorter scale length. And that's a common misconception too. I see a lot of players that are like, I have this 24-inch Jaguar, I assume I need really light strings. And you can, and have them be even more slinky. But if you want that guitar to feel the same as, like a Fender Strat, you have to go up a little bit. Yep.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. So the next one is from Eric, and he says, Scott, at one point in the past, I saw a post online that pointed toward a possible offering of flat wounds, which I think this is an interesting question. It's like 2024-ish. Any updates, man? Are we going to see flat wounds from Stringjoy?
We are still working on them, getting further all the time. I'm not sure if it'll be this year or early next year. But they're very much in the pipeline. We've got some stuff that we're really excited about. To be perfectly frank, like at this point, for a long time, it was really working on the R&D of them. I think that we're like 98% there. The biggest reason we haven't done it yet is that we keep growing. So we keep adding more and more dealers and getting much more like large accounts and things like this that are super exciting. The thing is, the both of that always puts us in over and over again is, all right, we've got the right amount of people for the right amount of output that we're doing. We can spend a little bit of time kind of working on some R&D, and then we get, a Sweetwater or a musician's friend or something like that. And it's like, okay, we've got to put all of our energy into filling these orders for strings that we already make. So that's been the really hard part for us, is every time I'll try to get ahead so that I have enough time for R&D, something really great happens, which, knock on wood, is fantastic, but it does often kind of take our focus a little bit away from being able to do that. So it's been an ongoing challenge, but it's something we're working hard at. And I'm very excited to get what I think are some awesome flats out there into the world.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and we, same problem here we experience as well. It's as a small company, growing company, it's, hey, we meet this demand and then we have more and we run to catch up. But it's great to know that we can look for flat wound. So Eric, definitely keep an eye out. And then the next one we've got here is from Daniel, and he says, hey, I've got to geek out for a minute on how much I used to love seeing some of my favorite bands and artists listed on the back of certain other string manufacturers. And I remember this too, because Slash played, Slinkies or whatever. And I mean, it's pretty cool, the artist endorsements. So he said, is Stringjoy partnered with any artists today? And are you looking to continue to grow those artist partnerships?
Oh yeah. We work with hundreds and hundreds of artists. We don't have them on the box, though that's not a bad idea, but and that is a really cool thing that Ernie Ball does, and is like really uniquely them. And to be honest, I don't really want to bite that from them. They're like a pretty iconic brand that I respect a lot. But yes, we've got a ton of artists and are always looking to add more. We actually just put out our first signature set for an artist, for Mark Morton from Lamb of God. That happened about a month ago or 6 weeks ago. So that was a really exciting move for us too, to kind of jump into that. And we've got a couple more artist sets like that in the pipeline, because a lot of the artists that we work with play these very specific gauges. So being able to make that information public and be able to say, hey, here's this set that, a guitarist that you really look up to plays, and here's what it feels like on his guitar, you can buy that too. So we're excited to be able to do some more of that as time kind of wears on.
That's awesome. Okay. Well, I'm also going to break here as well. It's funny how fast time goes by when you're talking about good stuff. I'm going to launch another poll as well. And this time we're going to ask, what is your favorite non-standard tuning? So everybody can vote on this one. Are you a drop tuner? Do you like open tuning? Ostrich tuning, which actually Will educated me about this one, about, tuning all the strings to the same tuning, or maybe you have another one. And if it is other, throw it in the comments. We'd love to hear. Like,
it could be Dadgad or Nashville tuning's a very popular one.
Nashville.
we set up a lot of people with, which is always cool. Ostrich is one that I had actually kind of forgotten about. I know like Joni Mitchell and like Sonic Youth would use tunings like that a lot, where it's just like it's all the same note throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, it is pretty interesting. So it looks like the number one category are our drop tuners, and I'm guessing
Yeah.
some people that probably play heavy music. And I even see some familiar names too, like Leonardo Yanez. Like, what's up, man? Glad to see you in here. I know you play some heavy music, so you might be in that crew there. But yeah, I think drop tuning is pretty popular. Open tuning
Yeah.
was the second highest, and some
Yeah.
others as well.
I'm a big fan of open tuning going back many years.
Yeah.
I really like OpenE personally.
Mm-hmm.
OpenG is really fun. The funny thing about
Yep.
OpenG though is like that's the Keith Richards tuning. Keith Richards only played with 5 strings in OpenG, and so I honestly, when I play in OpenG, there's a lot of cool riffs that are available, and every single one that I ever find, I'm like, oh no, that's that Rolling Stones song.
Right. It was
I
all Keith.
truly think, yeah, Keith has like mined that tuning for every like intuitive lick that can come out of it. But it's
Right.
fun to mess around with. I truly think like if you try it, you'll be like, oh wait, that's Start Me Up. Shoot.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It all goes back to Keith. That's awesome.
Yeah, I can't think of any artist that has like is that closely intertwined with the tuning. I mean, obviously any slide guy is gonna, play an open to some degree.
Right.
But that's such a piece of Keith.
Yeah,
Or
totally.
Keith.
So, another question here from the audience as well. What would be the best type of strings to use for a Strat with a floating tremolo? And I think the key there is
Yeah.
floating, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I mean, any string that's going to have like overall like balance tension is always going to be generally better, I think, for most guitarists, especially when you get something with like a floating tremolo. Having a more even dispersion of tension from string to string is helpful for keeping that in tune versus having sort of uneven amounts of tension from string to string. But in general, I think any quality string that's going to be able to do what it can do, right? Like, see, you have two kind of variables going on here: the degree to which the string itself is willing to hold tuning, and the degree to which like your tremolo system is willing to hold tuning.
Yeah, exactly.
So the strings outside of like balance tension can't help the tremolo outside of its setup. But you certainly want to eliminate those variables as much as you can. So a string that's going to have great tuning stability is certainly gonna help. That way, if you do experience those tuning issues, you at least know it's more than likely the setup of the tremolo.
Yeah, and there's so much art that goes into that as well. And I actually started my career as a guitar tech, and I mean, we could
Oh,
nerd out
cool.
for a long time about how to set up a trim to float properly. And I think
Yeah.
commonly a lot of people don't really know how to do that. And and then there's the whole if you really are using the trim a lot, do you use a locking system or things
Yeah.
like that? So maybe we'll cover that in another session.
Yeah.
Last question we've got here, and then I'll move on to some more that I've got on our end. Back to the flat rounds. So
Mhm.
when flat rounds roll out, are you guys looking at doing acoustic flat rounds as well? Frederick wanted to know that.
Good question. No, very unlikely that we would do that. There is only one company I know of that does make acoustic flat wounds, like a true like ribbon style flat. I don't mean like polished like a flat top sort of thing.
Yep.
But a true OG flat. And that's Dogal in Italy, who makes some really cool stuff. They have this. I'm actually big fans of the stuff they do. They make a lot of string sets that, in my opinion, don't have a wide usage. But so it's hard for a lot of us that are kind of higher volume to make and like kind of justify the shelf space. But for the people that want them, they kind of make those acoustic flat ones. The problem with acoustic flat ones is that they sound dead, and most acoustic players tend to like more brightness, and that's just inherent to a flat wound.
Right.
And it's something I wonder about. We get a lot of, when we get flat wound requests, we'll get people that email us and are like, hey, wonder when flat ones are coming, because I had this 8-string guitar and I'm really stoked. And we'll often be like, hey, we're working on them. Why? Tell me why. And what it usually comes down to is that they played their basis flats and we're like, these feel great. But the thing is, they sound like flats. There's a reason, like, flat wound strings on guitar make you sound like Wes Montgomery. They have like a very quick kind of die off in terms of sustain. They have that sort of tubby, bassy sound. So it's definitely a concern of mine when it comes to flats, that we're going to get a lot of people that will buy them, expecting them to sound like super bright, rock and roll electric guitar strings, because that's just not what flat ones do.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And interestingly enough, and correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I believe all of your Fender Jazz Masters came with flat wounds originally from the factory Fender, or was it a mix?
Yeah, so I've not been able to substantiate that 100%. I hear that a lot. They definitely were
Hmm.
coming with heavier gauges,
Right.
regardless, and that definitely has something to do with the ways in which offset guitars perform. As you can see, I've got a Jag back there, and there's a Jazzmaster that you can't see. I do typically find that they work really well with 11s. I understand the concept of it, that like kind of moving over that bridge would be easier with flats.
Yeah.
But I kind of I doubt it a little bit, whether they were all rolling off that way. I mean, the early, like Fender was a big proponent of round wound strings and hexagonal core really, really early. I have like a 1953 or something Fender catalog,
Hmm.
where they talk about all the strings shipping with hexagonal core, really, really heavy round wound strings. So anyway, somebody probably has dug up more info than I have on the Jazzmaster thing. I would like classify that as like probably a myth, just because I haven't seen anything to totally
Yeah.
substantiate it. But I don't know. I could be totally wrong there.
Yeah, well, that's another thing that we're demystifying. Yeah, because I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
and we go back even, and I'm old enough to know the times that rumors floated around before the internet could solve all of them in the forums, right? And
yeah.
so I had always heard that, younger and question if that was really the
And
truth.
and strings are an interesting one too, man. I mean, so few people on the planet really know that much about strings that like, I'll go into the forums and it's just like wrong, 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 wrong.
Right.
Everyone has
Yeah.
very, very heavily opinionated
Yes.
answers that don't, are just not right
Yeah.
as far
No
as it comes
factual
to strings.
basis. Imagine that on internet forums, right? That people
Yeah,
have
and I
heavy
mean,
opinions
again,
that aren't
like
true.
I the string industry writ large is bears some responsibility in that. Like I see a lot of stuff. There's one, it's a very small company that on their webpage advertises that they use only first drawn wire. Um, that's not a thing. It is a thing in the sense that like when you change out a new die and you start to draw wire, you have the first stuff that comes out. That gets thrown away because it's bad. The die needs to wear in a little bit and get dialed out. But beyond that, that's not a thing that you can access. So there are definitely like companies out there without naming any specific names, and it's not generally the big guys. It's usually more the small guys,
Yeah.
or people that private label, that throw a lot of stuff out there that like if you're in the industry, you're like, what are they talking about?
Right.
That's super not
Yeah.
a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. Lots of misconceptions for
Yeah.
sure. So I'm going to do this. I know we're already a little over the halfway point. I'm going to go ahead and post the promo code in case somebody needs to leave. And
Cool.
we're going to, I think, email all of the attendees as well to give this information. But I'm going to go ahead and put it here in the chat. Promo code for our website, BuyOrBorrowMusic.com. If you just use Stringjoy411, you can add that promo code when you're at checkout, and it will discount the price of your Stringjoy strings. So we want to make sure everybody gets to try a pair before we
Yeah.
wrap up today. But if you're good, maybe we'll keep going from another 10 minutes here. I got a couple of other
I'm good,
questions.
man. As
Okay.
as long as you want to talk about this stuff, I enjoy it. It's my my milieu. It's what I'm in every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, we got a couple of other questions from
Yeah.
the group, so I just want to keep throwing these out. Chris had a question. He says, do you guys have any intent to ever branch into making ukulele strings? That's a really good question.
Yeah. Yeah, so we can talk about ukulele strings and classical guitar strings by extension, because they're kind of interesting. We don't make them yet. Classical guitar is definitely like on our roadmap, but several years out, I would imagine. Uke strings maybe sooner. Here's the fun thing. So classical guitar strings used to be made with gut. Typically, like it could be pig's gut, sheep gut, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until like the 40s when DuPont, I believe, developed nylon, that Augustine and Andre Segovia were like, hey, I wonder if we can use this nylon to make guitar strings. Maybe it'll work kind of like gut. And that became kind of the more standard type of material that you would see for classical strings, and then eventually ukulele strings, replacing gut. The interesting thing about that, at first, when I was like, I didn't know much about classical strings in the early days. And so I was looking and I was like, the diameter listings for these are like 0.02955. Like that's a really specific thing. And then 0.0323, things like that. And I was like, that's odd. I wonder how they landed on that. I was like, maybe they were just so thoughtful. They were like, no, a 29 doesn't work, but a 29, 25, that's perfect. And it was a little while before I realized in doing some kind of checking, those are just based on fishing line. So that was, I can't remember, either 60, 80, and 100, or like 50,
Mhm.
60, and 80. But weights of fishing line were what determined the diameter that became the standard for E, B, and G classical guitar strings, and that still kind of exists to this day. So this is a long way of saying, if I was like a ukulele luthier, I would just buy reels of fishing line instead of buying strings. Now that is not like, there are some other cool, advances in this, like Aquila in Italy made Nile gut that you're seeing some companies utilize now, which is like a very unique material they made to kind of sound like gut and nylon. So you do see some material variances there that kind of define different companies. But for the most part, it all just bleeds off of the fishing industry. So if you play like classical guitar, you'll know that there's like kind of your standard like nylon strings, and then there's fluorocarbon, which came around in the past couple of decades as like companies were marketing it as this brighter set of strings, and it is. But it's not that somebody was like, hey, we should engineer a material for classical guitar that's going to sound more crystal clear. What happened was, in the fishing industry, they were like, the fish can see our lines and they're not fishing as well, so let's make a material that will be totally clear so that we can catch more fish. And then the guitar market was like, hey, we should try that. Oh, it's brighter.
There, yeah, right.
Here's our new brighter strings.
There you go.
So it does. It's just kind of funny to me. It does piggyback just a lot off the fishing industry.
That is so interesting. And again, all the things that, I had no idea what we were going to learn today, but just the correlations between the fishing world and guitar strings and all these.
Yeah, it's unexpected,
crossover.
Right?
Yeah, extremely unexpected, but it makes perfect sense. And especially when you get back to, well, why was a string the size it was? Oh, it's because the fishing line industry did it, and we use that. And of course now everyone, and us as musicians, we never get superstitious, right? Like we never have to use exact germanium transistors at a certain temperature or anything like that. So that's
and it's very true of the amp world and the pedal world too. I mean, the musical instrument market is small. It just is. You do have in the string world like companies that are doing a couple $100 million a year, which is a long way from where we are. But as an overall market, it's a pretty small thing. So there's not the money in the musical instrument market always to like just totally R&D, brand new things like transistors. And certainly there wasn't back in the 60s and 50s and 70s. So for the most part, you see mad scientists just seeing what they can get from Radio Shack or whatever that were made for other purposes and adapting those into something musical, and of course tweaking them and changing them. But for the most part, we're kind of more like scrappers. We find materials from other industries and see how we can apply it. And that's like an interesting kind of note here, just when we're talking about the size of the musical instrument industry. Elixir Strings is, a lot of people don't know, a division of W.L. Gore, the Gore-Tex company. And they, as a business, is larger than the entire musical instruments industry combined, and by far, like by a lot. So the largest company in the musical instrument industry, at least that I know of, is Elixir Strings, but not, the strings are this little tiny thing.
The tiniest piece.
Yeah, but I think they're like an 18 or $20 billion company overall. And, probably the total music instrument market is under 10 billion, I would assume.
Yeah, I think it's like 9 billion. Yeah. So
yeah, that feels really about right.
So I've got a couple more questions, but on a note about that, I forget which podcast I was listening to the other day, but they mentioned that Marshall now, that their amplifier sales are actually like less than 9% of their total revenue.
They've been able to go into pro audio really well in
Bluetooth
a way that
speakers too. They said Bluetooth speakers was representing, I think it was over 25% of total revenue, which was,
and that's what, you're right. It's not really, it's consumer electronics more than pro audio. That's a move that Gibson tried to make under the previous administration. But Marshall seems to have landed it, whereas Gibson kind of went the other way and has been refocusing on guitars. But I believe it. I totally do.
So I've got one, and this one, I think it's not as much of a question as it is a statement. This one's from Leonardo. He said, "This is not a question, but just wanted to say thank you for the amazing strings. Since I can select my own gauge, I feel like I'm part of the Stringjoy family. This is a game changer for many guitar players who never know why the same strings feel different on two guitars with the same tuning. I've been I've been like a lot of musicians, including me in the past, have been wondering why when I tune my guitar from E standard to drop C, the strings felt so loose, or why, right? Whether another guitar felt so good. Scale length is one of those things that most people didn't really think about for 15 years. And today, Stringjoy with the tension calculator
Yeah.
is solving that issue and it's disappearing. So thank you for the awesome tool. And then he said, I'm sorry for the long statement, but that's awesome, Leonardo. Thank you,
Thank you
man.
so
Yeah.
much, man. That is so cool. And for those of you that are watching that don't know what he's referencing, we have just a free to use tension calculator called at tension.stringjoy.com that you can use to kind of adjust a particular tuning or a particular guitar to play like another. So that's really awesome. That makes me really happy, Leonardo.
Yeah, sure. And so this next one is from Daniel. He says, I noticed that there's a lot of community between the boutique pedal makers. And I agree with that. I mean, you see so many
Yeah.
folks, and Josh Scott is the king of this, right? Like working
Mhm.
with other companies. So there's so much community there in terms of cheering each other on. He asks, does that same community exist amongst the string manufacturers? That's a really good question.
That's an excellent question. Broadly speaking, no. I think we all have some friends that we have at other companies, as will happen with trade shows and stuff, but not nearly to the extent of the pedal world. And the pedal world is really unique in that. That doesn't exist as much in amplifiers. It certainly doesn't exist in guitars at the larger scale.
Yeah.
And it definitely doesn't exist in strings. Now, my guess is this is maybe a dangerous statement, but the pedal world in the last 15 years has been a boom market, right? So anyone could kind of put out a pedal that costs, in some cases in drive pedals, maybe 30, 40 at the high end, $50 to make and sell it for, as much as price can command. So when that is kind of what's going on in the market, everyone are pals.
Yeah.
If we're all
it's easy to be
fishing,
friends when you're all printing money.
yeah, if we're all just throwing a fish line in and we're all catching, kingfish, we're all total buds, right?
Right.
But now you are seeing that market adjust a little bit. And I've got a lot of friends in the pedal world, and so they're friendly folks. So I think that it'll exist. But I wonder if it'll become a little bit less buddy once people are actually having to kind of compete with each other.
Yeah. And it's funny because I mean, what you talk about there is one of the core reasons, our business model was created, which is, there's so much to choose from now as musicians.
Yeah.
And, I mean, even if you go back a decade ago, I mean, the amount of options now are tenfold, right? Because you've got so many boutique companies. We work with a lot of great ones too. And I tell you, one of the smallest companies we work with that I just love is Summer School Electronics. And but you see that collaboration, like they work and know the Earthquaker crew, right? Like I actually met them at the last Earthquaker Day show last year, and it's just so funny, how that stuff all comes together and how
I think
how collaborative that world is.
The way that it kind of tweaks from a business side is whether if you think about it as a buyer, are you making a decision where you're like, I need one overdrive pedal, who am I going to get it from?
Yep.
Versus when a market goes more collectible, when you get to the point where it's like, I want all the overdrive pedals. In a more collectible type market, everyone can be buds because we're not saying, hey, the Greer like Southland or whatever, it has to be the one overdrive and you have to, like that's the only one you're going to buy and you're not going to give any money to anyone else. You probably have 13 overdrive pedals, but as it shifts into more of a market where it's like, all right, I need a delay pedal, I'm only going to buy one, who am I going to buy it from? Those types of markets is where you see more competition exist, and strings have always kind of been more the latter. Most people don't collect bazillion sets of strings from different brands. You kind of choose your dog, or maybe you're like, I like these flats for my bass, I like these rounds for my guitar. So it just can be a little bit more higher competition, but there's a lot of people out there that I super respect in that world, and a lot of families that have done really impressive things over the years. So it's a cool market, and it's an honor to be a part of something that's like so niche that, like I said, so few people really kind of understand, and I'm learning new things every day. So yeah, it's a strange one.
Yeah, and I think market size really plays into that as well. I mean, because where you guys are at niche, but
well, that's actually the interesting thing. I mean, the string market as a whole is 6 times the pedal market at least.
Yeah, it's so crazy. And
so
again,
the market's big, but it's less fractured.
Exactly, and less participants from that perspective as well. And for any of those who are joining that may not be familiar with us and our model, but one of the reasons we even started this business was because I was a pedal junkie, and I mean, you can see behind me, this is just a small piece of my way too large collection. But there's so many choices, right? And how do you make the right one? And if you buy something and you don't like it and you sell it and lose it, we wanted to create a model that fixed that and fundamentally changed the way that musicians get their gear. So, that's why our subscription works the way it does. You can start at $19 all the way up to, to our headliner program if you really want VIP gear, and be able to do that in a much more cost-effective way rather than, having to shell out too much cash for what might end up being overpriced or overhyped gear. So,
and these days when it's gotten kind of harder to, in the past, like I would always like buy pedals, and if I didn't like it, I'd just sell it on Reverb, and do it. That's gotten a little bit more tricky, I think, these days. There's a lot of stuff that kind of sits on Reverb for a little bit longer than it did a couple years ago. So being able to try things and, not have a way to like trade that out for something else and find what really works for you is a great adaptation, and makes more sense now than ever, I think.
Yeah. Well, and we're seeing that as well because, it's the saturation, right? Because used to, I mean, even if you were a seller on Reverb, you're just competing with other people selling that one Boss SD1 or whatever. But now there's so many different options. So it's definitely become a challenge for the average musician. So let's put out one final request for questions. If anybody's got anything they want to throw over to Scott as a last call for questions, we can take those now. Great turnout today too. Thank you for everybody for hopping in. And it looks like we've had most people hanging out pretty much the whole time, listening to us nerd out about guitar strings and pedals and everything else. So that's been great. So yeah, we'll give it just another minute. I guess while we're waiting for that, I'll throw you one last question.
Please.
Man versus machine. What's the secret sauce in the equation of making great guitar strings? Is it more of the technology of the devices, or is it the human operator that makes it happen?
Yep. Our philosophy as a business is that you need both. And there are companies in our industry that use very, very old machines with, I assume, like people that really know how to kind of make them work, but they're fighting the machine at every step. And then there are companies that are these days going almost fully robotic, where a machine just winds strings, no one looks at it, no one sees it, and then you get them at home. We believe that the way that you make great strings is great people working with the best tools. And so that's what we try to do. We really are obsessive about keeping our machines into great shape, keeping them updated. Like when we find something, we roll it out to all of our machines. And again, they're generally some of the newest in the whole industry. So we've got great tools to begin with, but those tools are just tools, right? Like I can make something horrible and I can make something great on the same tool, even if that tool is as good as it can be. The tools kind of, I view it as like a limiting factor to like the great person with the worst tool, like they're just, that might cap them a little bit, but they'll still do pretty well. We want our tools to be able to rise to any level that the operators can, but at the end of the day, it's driven by operators. And we really believe that like great people make great strings with great tools. And that's how we get there. So I think it's kind of a 50-50. And the way that we do that is somebody's working with the machine. So when they're like loading the core on, they're threading the wrap wire by hand, they're starting the wind, and they're observing that entire process as the string is being wound the whole way. And they feel it afterwards. And this is an important thing we do to detect whether there's any changes, because what'll happen in a lot of big companies, they'll make, this enormous batch of strings, and then it goes to QC and they see whatever you can see after the fact, which for one, a lot of the stuff you wouldn't know unless you see it when it's happening. It's hard to detect, on 9,000 turns of wire on a 24. But for two, we want our operators to be able to be like, wait, there's something wrong. Stop, fix it, throw that string out, and then make sure that all the strings from that point have improved upon that and are making great strings. So that's kind of our model. And, honestly, a lot of that's not like crazy rocket science. It's just like focusing on how do we make great strings. All right, we need great tools, we need great people, and we need to be able to give them the time to do that ultimately, and not just be like, hey, you need to be making things 10 times as fast.
Yeah, meet a quota. I once heard a quote, and I love this one. It was, a great hammer will not make a great carpenter, but a great carpenter will always want a great hammer. And I think that's a really good way to put it. Yep. Yeah, and it's that connection again between the man and the machine. So,
and it's funny because we're saying that in terms of the manufacturing itself, but it's true for you as players too. It's the exact same sort of thing. Like
you could fill that with guitars or amps or pedals. It's the same.
Can an amazing player sound great on a lousy set of strings? Absolutely.
Yep.
Like until one breaks, but otherwise, totally. Like it's not going to make you just a whole different player. It's not going to turn you into Joe Satriani if you don't have those skills already. But as you said, especially for like the kind of cost of admission, why not have a great tool, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Know what to do with it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, so
I'm a
we
big jazz fan, and Charlie Parker in like the greatest jazz concert ever. I believe it was in Montreal. I have the record, but he flew in and his saxophone didn't make it, so he played this plastic saxophone for the whole concert, and it's an amazing concert because Charlie Parker's that good that he made a plastic saxophone sound amazing. But he did not continue using that plastic saxophone. He definitely preferred to use something else.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So we got one more question from the group. This one was anonymous, but it says, I've had a Taylor DN8 for 13 years and
Wow.
have only changed the string once.
Wow.
How bad is that? And he has the sweat emoji. How bad is that? It still sounds great. Should I change them just because? What do you think?
There's no need to change them just because. If you're enjoying the way that the strings are performing and the way that they're sounding, you know, it's not going to hurt your guitar or anything like that. I should start with that. Like, I don't like changing strings. I kind of hate it. That's a little bit of what got me into this. Was I wanted to make strings that you wouldn't have to change quite so often. So I definitely resonate with that. I don't change strings until my guitars need it. Now you might find that one day when you do change strings, you'll be like, I wish I'd done this sooner. It sounds so much better. But yeah, you're not hurting the string or I'm sorry, you're not hurting the guitar at all. If you're fine with it, you're fine with it. It's all good.
Yeah. Well, and I've been in the studio with a lot of people, and I've even found this preference for myself sometimes, like especially with acoustic guitars, especially if you're going for a mellow type of track. Sometimes it's kind of nicer to have strings that have got a little bit of age, so they're not quite so crispy. They've got the more mellow tone, and then you have to do less EQ work. So yeah, musicians are finicky folks, right?
What you see, it's kind of interesting. Like when people talk about like dead strings, like when a string goes dead, it's kind of funny because so in the bass, like in the guitar world, guitarists like put on a new set of strings and they're like, oh, these sound perfect. And then, you know, like we talked about with some brands, after 3 days, they're like, they totally die. Now they sound kind of muddy.
Yeah.
Bassists don't talk that way. The bassists talk about stringsing. Yeah. So it's always people like, I just changed my strings. They sound way too bright and shrill. It's horrible. And anyone, you know, on Reddit or on a forum will be like, that's the stringsing. Give it like 2-3 days, and then they'll be perfect. They just need to break in. And I'm like, they're talking about the same thing, right? It's just like for one person, that's like, oh, these died, they're useless. And for someone else, like, finally, they sound good,
right?
Which I just find kind of fascinating. Like, there's no, you know, it died. It's more of a perspective thing than anything else. It's just whether you like that early curve of tonality or you like, you know, them kind of settling in and sounding like that for a long time.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm going to launch our final poll here, and this is about favorite string type. And so basically what we're looking at here is do you like nickel, steel, nylon, phosphor, bronze? So if everybody wants to chime in on that, we can share results.
So it's interesting. You've got two different concepts. There's like nickel and phosphor, which are wrap wire, and then steel and nylon, which are core wire. So if you like nickel strings, you like steel strings. If you like nylon strings, you're probably not. It's usually silver plated copper, so that'd be different. But yeah. So it's an interesting thing. Those are like two different parameters.
Yeah, and so it looks like nickel, and you know, I mean, I think most of us, especially for electric guitar players, right? It's like, oh, nickel wound or nickel alloy, right? Versus, so it looks like that's coming in, and then for acoustic players, you know, bronze or phosphor.
Yeah, like people phosphor or 80/20 are kind of the two big competing ones for acoustic. You can use nickel strings on acoustic too, but they just have a slightly different sound.
Yeah, different sound. Yeah, so we've got that done. So we'll wrap that up and publish results. Well, we're getting right to the hour. I mean, first of all, this has been awesome. I'm going to go back and listen to this and probably learn something that I even forgot in the time that we've had to chat. So Scott, we really appreciate you joining with us, and a reminder as well for anyone that is hopping on just now or late in the webinar, we did put a code in the chat section for getting your free set of strings from BuyOrBorrow Music. So the code is Stringjoy411. So you can go to the website, grab a set of strings, put them in your cart, use that at checkout, and it's on the house. And we hope you enjoy experience.
That is so cool. Thank you so much for doing that, Dave. For all the players out there. I hope everyone that gives it a try. I hope that they can kind of change your mind about what strings can be. That's certainly what we aim to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And our pleasure too. You know, it's funny. I mean, I remember the first time I had been exposed to Stringjoy. I think it was actually my dad that he's a player too, that was mentioning that, you know, hey, there's this cool Stringjoy brand. But yeah, I mean, it's a fundamental difference. And I was a Diodario player for many
Mhm.
years,
Me too.
and which
Yeah.
great strings, right? But it's again, you come back to the hammer and the carpenter thing.
Mhm.
It's just a personal preference. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I have great admiration for that brand. They make an exceptionally consistent product.
yeah,
I think that I think that we make better strings. Of course I do, or I probably wouldn't be doing it. But to be at that scale and make things that are that consistent, it's kind of like a McDonald's thing or an Anheuser-Busch
right.
thing. And if you talk to any craft brewer and you're like, who do you really admire? You're like, you guys probably hate Budweiser. They're always like, no, man, Budweiser's incredible. They
They
make beer in
benchmark.
18 different plants out of like agricultural products, and it always tastes the same. Is it the best beer? No, but how do they get it always tasting the same?
Always
Not a direct comparison, but that's just to say I definitely admire them. That's what I played initially as well.
Yeah, yeah, right on. Well, listen, Scott, thank you so much. We also will be publishing this as well. If anybody wants to share it with their friends, we're going to be putting this on our YouTube channel in full, and we'll be sharing some of this across social as well. So hopefully everybody learned something. I know I certainly did. And we appreciate you hopping on, and hopefully we've made a lot of new fans of Stringjoy.
I hope so. Thanks so much for having me, Dave, and thanks everyone out there for joining and listening.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody have a great day. Take care.